to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands where I am based, Turrbal and Yagara peoples, and to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. Thank you so much for having me here today. I feel like a disclosure that I don't have my ethics through or the first time with committee, and I feel like I've got a lot to learn with ethics processes. But what I thought I'd talk about today are maybe thinking how we might have responsibilities beyond ethics processes to the groups that we work with, but also to researchers more broadly. So they're the two big ideas I'm going to talk about. I really work in the violence space and predominantly around domestic and family violence. I'll draw on a couple of examples from two projects today. One involves violence against women with cognitive and intellectual disabilities, and that was completed with a range of fantastic practitioner partners for the E-Safety Commissioner. And the other is a project I'm working on for the next probably three or so years for the Australian Research Council on technology facilitated abuse in the context of domestic and family violence. That project and my work more broadly generally really involves survivors, advocates and practitioners in lots of different spaces. So thinking about legal spaces, domestic and family violence, health, tech, telecommunications, and I'm conducting interviews and focus groups with all of those groups. Also co-design workshops with a survivor colleague and a lot of different survivor groups. There's digital methods that I'm incorporating as part of the interviews to essentially see what works and does not work so well when people are trying to respond to and prevent tech abuse. There's surveys with police and magistrates, interviews with perpetrators, consultation with pretty much all of the groups I've mentioned, and then also participant observation with one of the main groups that does safety audits for survivors. I'm not going to go over some of the main guiding principles that we have to work with these groups because they're obviously things that you're really familiar with, but I would like to emphasise that I think it's really important that we are looking at providing honorariums for survivors, recognising their time, expertise and experience, and really that researchers are always building this into their projects. There's an idea that I want to come back to a couple of times, and it's really encapsulated in this quote from Bender, which essentially is talking about how we need to obviously think about protecting participants, but in ways that is not going to restrict their participation in research and in particular their agency. We know that safety of participants is paramount, and in the second part of my presentation, I'm going to be thinking about safety as researchers, and obviously that's going to be guiding all project decisions. So I've just outlined some of the practical things that that means I'm thinking about in research and some of the flags that I'm conscious of working with people. To give one example, strangulation is a significant flag of homicide, non-fatal strangulation. But it's not something that people will often identify as strangulation or use that word. And so it's being really conscious of the ways that people might talk about strangulation and also being really conscious of addressing that that has been something they've raised in safety planning processes. We have a lot of ways to mitigate distress in research design, but something that I feel is really important, and thinking back to that quote I had from Bender about ways we're not restricting people from research, is thinking about agency. So something that is really important to me is at the start of, say, an interview or a focus group, working through a design about how we will handle distress. If somebody becomes upset about a question, we talk about how we're going to manage it. There's a tendency, I think, sometimes for researchers to say to ethics committee, oh, if someone becomes upset, I'll stop that question or I'll stop the interview. But we're thinking about a group that's often been really silenced in a lot of spaces and people who do want to contribute around difficult and distressing topics. So I think that there's a way that we can really think about negotiating what that process looks like so that we are making sure we're protecting participants, but also not hindering their agency in that kind of process. A lot about methodology that you'll be really familiar with, but something that I want to flag that I think researchers are engaging more and more with, and this is a quote from a survivor colleague of mine, that I'm more than a data source, and there is a tendency to just really focus on things like interviews and focus groups, but ideally what I'm hoping is that we'll see more and more co-design, so we're not just engaging with survivors about how we create and execute projects, but really in co-owning outcomes, co-owning knowledge, and co-owning resources moving forward. In terms of recruitment, something that I traditionally have done is engage services, and there's sometimes services that have a long-standing relationships with survivors. So it might be a support service, it might be a legal service where there's an ongoing contact point, or it could be a court advocacy service where it's more of a one-off contact. And for the different relationships that survivors have, there's different consultation required of the services and also a different screening process that is involved. Something that I hadn't done before this year that I found a bit terrifying was engage survivors through social media. With services who have an ongoing relationship with survivors, we can be, I guess, more assured of possible support that is available. But someone on the ethics committee had actually flagged something with me that we know, and that's that a lot of people will never engage services. And so social media is a way that we will make contact with people who will never engage a service, and that's quite a lot of people. So I'm just going to talk through a couple of things about what that process has looked like for me. It involved firstly the creation of a Twitter post, and I had obviously feedback from the committee on what that looked like, and also a number of peak agencies that helped me promote it and advocates to make sure that it had content that would be understandable, accessible, but we had kind of a safe plan for promotion. Then I developed a screening process, and I think I felt like I was more worried about this than the committee for sure. And what I had was a lot of feedback from advocates in different spaces, so domestic violence advocates, advocates that were specialists around technology and domestic violence, advocates that were specialists around trauma, and police officers, so that I was thinking about safety from a lot of different points. So this is the screening process that I've been using for survivors who've experienced technology facilitated domestic violence. Firstly, there's a question about contact with the abuser. If somebody's still with the abuser, then they are not in a safe space to proceed. The next question is about a safety audit for technology. And so what I'm thinking about here is what steps have been taken to try and check technology. Was something that you did, friends or family? Was it a service? Was it a safer in the home? And that's kind of a broad national program, a private company, police. And then to really break down the kinds of devices, the kind of accounts, and really thinking about some of the vulnerabilities that might have been overlooked here. And at each point here, there was the option to refer. And what was really important to me is it was referring to a number of different resources, and also culturally appropriate resources, and also resources that survivors could get a free high-level safety check. Then we talked about concerns with technology that they might have, and moved on to talking about trauma. And this is really about making sure someone felt like, in terms of their state and well-being, that they're in a safe space to participate. And here again, I'm thinking of that Binder quote earlier on, where we are certainly making sure that participants are in a safe space without hindering their agency. And this is, I think, something tricky because we have an idea, a stereotype, it's not a reality, that when someone exits violence, the violence stops, and it does in fact often escalate and continue. So the idea that somebody will never experience any trauma again is really a fallacy. But it's about really recognising participant agency and linking up with support at that stage. And here, thinking about trauma, I really liked this article some colleagues in Victoria wrote, which is thinking about the trauma kind of narrative and the tendency to, as they say, construct victim survivors as inherently damaged, fragile and dysfunctional, erasing agency and rendering invisible their resilience and resistance to violence. So for me, I mentioned that idea about moving beyond institutional frameworks. So certainly I'm guided by the committee frameworks and a lot of our best practice models around doing violence research. And really key for me too is the ethos and frame that I'm using. And so I use a feminist framework. And what that means is that we're really thinking about not just the way that we're doing research, but also in the outputs that are produced. And it's really important that they are useful, that we're thinking about ways that we'll be dismantling power with this, ways that they're actually going to be used by the groups that we're working with. Another challenge I think we have in the violence space is how we're framing violence, and people often won't use some of the buzzwords. And so it's really thinking about ways we frame things like intrusions or harms, or the ways that we might think really critically about consent. And really thinking about the individual need and context, and also the social context. So I realised I had a picture of a vacuum cleaner earlier that probably looked very odd, but it was about this point and how we're not doing research in a vacuum by any means. We are doing research in a society where in many ways violence is facilitated, supported, legitimised. And that means that we have to confront and recognise things like victim blaming narratives. And so for me, validation for participants is a really important part of the process. Another element is certainly really thinking about a trauma-informed approach and making sure that we are working with participants on their terms and at their speed. And that means, for instance, recognising that somebody experiencing complex trauma might be communicating in a way in terms of chronology or in terms of narrative that is quite different from somebody who does not have complex trauma. And it's my job to meet that person and not to expect them to be communicating in a different way. Working together is really central to the framework that I use. And so I've mentioned this around agency with the distress kind of protocol that we have. And it's also very much about really being open to what the focus of the interview is, and that the participant has a lot of scope in how they move through things and what they want to tell me and how they are directing things, and it's for me to follow. And that really means also acknowledging my deficits in this space. And so I try to ask questions like, you know, what haven't I asked you? What else would you like me to know? I really try and close on emphasising about the privilege that I've had of hearing their voice and outlining their contribution. So for me, this project is really very much about trying to find ways forward, and survivors have solutions. Survivors know what is and is not working. And so it's very much about being driven by their recommendations and being really clear about how their contribution is being used. And that means my outputs are open access, my outputs are meant to be accessible and used by the sector and used by survivors. And I'm really clear about what that reporting back process looks like. And keeping in mind accountability, which is not just for my individual participants, but the broader sector that I'm working with. The last point that is always important, but especially around technology and violence, is not educating perpetrators. And this is kind of, I put down the bottom, it's a sector lament. And that means that I will be hearing about a lot of different strategies that perpetrators use, but I would not put those in any academic publication. I wouldn't put them in an open access resource. That sort of information is for, say, training, or when I've done sessions with police, that would be when you would be talking about some of those techniques. It's not appropriate to use them in an academic kind of setting. So this is just really quickly kind of a protocol script for the project that we did with women with cognitive and intellectual disabilities. So it was really mapping out the process around kind of privacy and making sure people were safe and comfortable, that support people were available. That was a big part of our work. Really, we're working with partners here. And that we were working with people in a strategy about managing distress, that we were emphasising the voluntary nature of the project in a sensitive manner, and that we were doing this checking in afterwards as we were going. So just really quickly, they're the sort of things that we do. And I love the discussion about information sheets and consent forms in the last presentation, and that was a big consideration for us in this project, and something that we developed with our practitioner partner. And then my colleague had her sister actually drew these pictures for us. So we made quite a lot of changes to the information and consent form in terms of bolding and size of font, and also adding pictures throughout. And we had quite a lot of drafts before we got it hopefully right. So I've mentioned some of the pathways for referrals, and one of our big things in the World Health Organization, for instance, guides is the expectation that researchers are trained around referral. So we might be looking to services for that. We certainly have links to services and supports and information sheets and consent forms. There is an expectation if resources aren't available, they're created, and this is something particularly in the practice space. We might be asking services to also be on advisory boards in giving feedback on design, execution, outputs and outcomes. And I'm going to come back to this, but that's a huge burden that we're expecting. So for me, in my work, the sort of things that I like to be prepared about and thinking about if there are referrals that people want to specialist practitioners or services. So for instance, culturally and linguistically appropriate services, tech safety, and making sure that all of these are freely available, that I'm not referring anybody to a costed service, key contact points at platforms and telcos. I know some of the people to contact who are going to be effective in that space. And then, of course, other supports. So something that I've found useful, and I have some fabulous colleagues who've done really great work in this space, memos of understanding with services. Why I think these can be really great is you're making sure everyone's on the same page with the kind of vision and framework and ethos. You've got really clear principles and protocols, and you've got a plan about outputs and outcomes too. So thinking about the non-government, government, and also community engagement, I feel like it's really important to understand the landscape and who is and is not included. Sometimes in ethics applications, we're just broad about, say, the sector, but I think it's really important to be aware of what that means in terms of the services and participants we are or are not engaging. Another thing I feel like researchers have a tendency to do is to talk about academic deficits. Oh, we've got a huge knowledge gap in this area, but a lot of practitioners will say, oh, that's something I've known for 5 or 10 years. And so I think it's really what I'd like to see happening a lot more is engagement with what is the practice knowledge. And that's really important to know what knowledge is going to be useful for sectors. And sometimes we're not looking at new knowledge, but we're providing an evidence base. And so it might be a really great program that a service runs, and we might have great data about how effective that is, that then can be used by, say, services in funding applications and such. As I mentioned, we're talking about especially non-government, government organisations that are overburdened and under-resourced, and that ideally means that researchers are building in funds for services, but also thinking about ways we're contributing or giving back. So building in money, building in training reports or webinars, but based on what services are asking for, not what we think that they want. There might be, of course, additional ethics procedures, and services will be wanting to protect participants, and that's sometimes from researchers. And unfortunately, we have legacies, especially with a few different community cohorts, of really bad relationships and bad work of researchers that have done a lot of damage. So there's a lot of rapport, relationship building, and reputation building that I think is necessary, and that takes time. So I guess what I would like to see, it's beyond, again, as I mentioned, it's beyond ethics processes, but what I'd really like to see is researchers thinking a lot about how their work can be used in advocacy, in activism. There are certainly barriers that are there. There's a lot of arguments I would make about why they should be overcome. They're certainly not always valued by academia, but they are our responsibility. They are what a lot of our codes and of best practice do emphasise, that there should be this policy and practice engagement. And there's specific mention in, for instance, the World Health Organization guidelines about how research should be used to advance policy and design interventions about violence, and I would say practice interventions too. There is an argument that research is going to be empowering and beneficial. It is going to be for some participants, but not everybody. But certainly we need to be thinking about the use and application of research. And I think that really means engagement and reporting in and reporting back, and really thinking about the limitations of academic outputs and thinking about what we need to be producing beyond that. And that has to be in a lot of different forms and formats. So the thing I want to finish up talking about, the second part, is some of the vulnerabilities about researchers, and apologies, this is probably things that a lot of people are familiar with, but unfortunately I feel like there's quite a few spaces and institutions where we don't talk about this enough. There are in our protocols expectations that we have specialised researchers, that researchers are not learning on the job how to do work in the violence space. And that means people should be really experienced about what their method is, how it's going to work in practice, that they've got pre-tested, piloted tools. But also it means learning about violence, learning about how violence manifests, the dynamics of violence, the causes, the impacts. Safety, it means learning about referrals and what referrals have to offer. And it means learning about this not just from academic sources, but really from engaging with particularly the non-government sector and also survivors directly. So it means engaging with a range of discourse, again, not just academic. Ideally, it means that people are trauma informed. One of the barriers I think we have is I'm not sure that there is a lot of institutional training around this. Sometimes supervisors are experienced, but sometimes they're not. They might have PhD, master's students working in this space who don't, and they're not experienced. And we do have, unfortunately, I fear, especially in the COVID environment, declining research funds and support, which means some of the external programs that might have been engaged in the past are not moving forward. I don't really have time to discuss this in detail, but I guess I would just flag that it's really important to be thinking about self-care, especially if we're thinking about lockdown and somebody's doing trauma-related work in the space that they live. Backlash is something I feel like ethics committees are really great thinking about in things like social media recruitment. Something I want to flag is it manifests very differently based on identity. And so people might have their cultural identity, their gender identity, their sexuality attacked. For instance, it really does differ person to person. There are some institutional guides and supports, but some of the best things can be mentors in areas who can help with things like safety planning. There's some great research on backlash. A colleague of mine in the UK wrote this fantastic article that I'm happy to share on her experience of backlash and really what it meant about doing work in that space. Compassion fatigue is, as the name sounds, when there is this kind of diminished capacity for empathy and exhaustion. It can come on quite suddenly. I'm going to talk really briefly about some coping strategies and opportunities to try and address this, but it certainly can be prevented. It comes on more suddenly than vicarious trauma. And I wanted to talk about vicarious trauma. I imagine quite a lot of people are familiar with it, but to really emphasise that we sometimes think a bit more about researchers working in safe spaces and people conducting interviews, for instance, in a safe physical space, but we don't necessarily think as much about the impact of field work. We don't necessarily think about what is happening during analysis, and that is for a lot of people when vicarious trauma comes up. In what's kind of different between vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue is it's really about a profound shift in worldview. It does also unfold over time. It affects people very differently, and it's absolutely not a sign of weakness. It's a cost of the work that we do, the empathy that we have and that we really should have. So some of the things that we can do are really thinking about why we're doing the work, the bigger picture and what it means, what we can control, what we can't control, and being really realistic about that. A whole range of different symptoms, and the two takeaways here that I would say is, again, it manifests differently for different people and it's not the same for each person over time. So there might be particular symptoms on one occasion and quite different on another, but what really is underscoring everything is this kind of fundamental shift of worldview. So people feel kind of quite purposeless, they feel quite hopeless and disconnected. There's a number of different coping strategies, and I'll talk really briefly about planning in this space too. But what's really important is awareness of the issue, balance in different work roles, and that means moving between different tasks, but also taking time away from work, trying to really remember why we're doing what we're doing and trying to get back that positive worldview. Reflecting is a great strategy, and working protectively. So what I would really love to see is that more people are developing plans for vicarious trauma as they're developing ethics applications, that it's not something that we're thinking about addressing afterwards. It's much harder to address afterwards, and we really should be working protectively. It can manifest in different ways with people with and without trauma. I don't have time to talk to this too much, but I've got some really great guides I'm happy to share. Supervision is an option. Some people aren't always happy going through university models, but there are professional supervision options. Mindfulness is something a lot of people find really useful. So meditation can be something that a lot of people find really useful. I really appreciated this point about accepting mistakes, because I think especially when we put so much personal value into what we're doing and something we feel really passionately about, we can't expect to be perfect, and I think it would be problematic if we were. And so we should always be trying to be better researchers in this kind of space. Connecting with others can be really good, and if possible, moving between different tasks. So I've got some really great resources I'm happy to share about building a toolkit and action plan. But essentially what is useful to do is to identify a range of risk factors, and they're not going to be static. They'll change over time. So there might be particular work pressures, there might be particular things in your personal life that are coming up, the signs and symptoms that you might be experiencing, strategies to address this, and there's a number of different ones. So while you're trying to think about things to do with the worldview, for instance, you might try and break down other components. So say you're having trouble sleeping, you'd be looking at maybe doing some exercise that will help, have a number of different benefits that can physically tire you out. So there's a couple of strategies to try and address the symptoms, but really also addressing that worldview element. Setting some goals to address the symptoms on kind of the more basic everyday level, but then ongoing, identifying barriers and obstacles that again aren't going to be static. And I mentioned that idea about reflexivity. So I always encourage students to keep some kind of diary, because you might think that you're coping really well, but then find, like, on reflection, if you look back at what you wrote a week ago or what you recorded on a voice memo a week ago, you might feel that you've actually been a bit disconnected, and certainly accessing supports. So I think this is my last slide, and I just wanted to flag that what I think we can do much better as a research community is really normalising vicarious trauma, recognising, talking more honestly and openly about preparing vicarious trauma plans, especially thinking about vulnerabilities with early career researchers and students, taking shared efforts to reduce trauma. Some of our top-down approaches can be problematic. Think about some of the wellbeing sessions that we have that are really geared at being more productive. With vicarious trauma, sometimes just taking a break, recharging is what is really important. So the kind of narrative that we sometimes have in academia about producing more and more and doing more is actually kind of quite toxic. Checking in, peer support. So there are all the things I guess I would advocate for, but I'd love just to see some more discussions about vicarious trauma in relation to ethics proposals. And that's me.